Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I think we'll make a start because it's 6:30 and I think most people have come in and assumed their seats. Thank you all for coming. My name is Ben Cowell. I'm the Deputy Chairman of the Heritage Alliance, and the important thing is I'm not Lloyd Grossman, who sends his apologies. He's unable to attend this evening, but this is one of our debate events that we tend to hold here at the Waldorf Hotel. Thank you very much to the Waldorf for hosting us. And thank you, of course, to our very generous sponsors, Ecclesiastical, for hosting this evening's debate, which is, as you can see, about diversifying heritage in the 21st century. And I've already failed to flick forward the slide, which is my name here. So thank you all very much for coming, and thanks to our excellent expert panel that I'll introduce in a moment, who are going to give us different perspectives on this multifaceted subject. I think it is possibly the most important debate that we can have in the heritage sector at the present time. It really is an important issue. Society is changing, the world is changing around us, and the heritage sector itself has to change. It has to change for moral reasons. It has to change for business reasons. It has to change in order to keep pace with society and to not lose support and credibility. And that's so important for the sector as a whole and, of course, for our support from government. And government is very concerned about the whole area of equality and diversity in the early 21st century. So this is a really, really important topic. There's plenty here for us to debate and discuss, and we're going to have a really good evening to talk through various different issues. For my mind, I think there are three fundamental problems that we might have in the back of our minds as we listen to our speakers tonight. I think there's an issue about how do we diversify audiences in the heritage sector. How do we get a diverse range of people visiting, experiencing, enjoying heritage and participating in it. There's a second problem about how do we diversify the workforce in the heritage sector. That's almost a different order of problem, but it's a huge problem nonetheless. And I think there's a general issue about how do we diversify the narrative that we employ in the heritage sector. How do we talk about heritage in ways that are properly reflect the diverse society that we live in? So I think we're thinking about diversity across a whole range of issues, fractures, difference within society, and we're going to explore this evening issues to do with race, with ethnicity, with gender, sexuality, class, disability. All of these things will come into our discussions this evening, and they're all incredibly important topics. I'm going to, in a moment, introduce our first speaker, who is Andrew Miller, who's going to be speaking tonight first. He's got to leave, unfortunately, by, I think, about 7 o'clock. So we're going to hear from Andrew at the outset. Andrew will be talking about the inclusion of disabled people in arts and culture. And we'll give a chance for any questions there might be of Andrew after his opening few words in a moment. But then after that, I think we'll ask each panellist to talk, and then we'll have a discussion session and a chance for any questions at the very end. Now, my excellent panel has also expertly sat in the order in which they're speaking, which somehow happened. I don't know quite how. But can I start with Corinne here? Corinne Fowler, who's going to be talking about the work she's been doing with the National Trust on the Colonial Countryside Project. Next to her is Abby, who will be talking about a project at the Pitt Rivers Museum about an inclusive community project using volunteering and the collection at the Pitt Rivers. We've got Jonathan Badiel next to Abby, who is going to be talking about the inclusion of young people in arts and creativity, and his background enables him to talk a lot about that subject. Next to Jonathan, we have Errol Francis, who is the CEO of Culture and who'll be talking about some of the projects that they're doing to promote diversity in arts and culture generally. And then we've got Sasha Sasha Coward, who's talking about LGBTQ heritage from the perspective of the Royal Museums in Greenwich. And at the end, we've got Margot Finn, next to Andrew, President of the Royal Historical Society, talking about issues of equality and diversity within the profession of professional history and historians, among other subjects, and public history generally. But next to Margot, we've got Andrew, and I wonder if we could start with a few words from Andrew. Let me just flick forward the slide. There we go. So Andrew Miller, as you can see, is the UK government's first disability champion for arts and culture. He's an arts producer, programmer, and executive. He's a BAFTA and RTS award-nominated producer and a director of arts and music documentaries. He's a National Council member of both Arts Council England and the Arts Council of Wales. And he's going to talk for us to open up our event this evening. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And I really do apologise for having to leave early this evening, as I'm sure this is going to be a fascinating and very relevant debate. Over the last year, I've had the privilege of future-gazing as a National Council member of Arts Council England. We're preparing a 10-year strategy, and we've been asking ourselves, artists and the public, what the arts should look like in 2030. So far, the most consistent response to our consultation has been the arts and its workforce must become more diverse. That means our national culture cannot remain as white, as middle class, and as able-bodied as it is today. And it's only very recently that deaf, disabled, and neurodiverse people have come to be seen as an essential part of that tapestry of diversity, partly due to disabled people being largely invisible in our wider society, only promoted, supported, empowered, and crucially funded in the field of sport. But not all of us are medal winners, and disabled people active in other areas of civic life, such as the arts, are emerging from behind the shadows of the Paralympians, and we're catching up fast. The Chief Executive of Arts Council England, Darren Henley, recently stated, "The work of disabled and deaf artists is often the boldest, most aesthetically adventurous art out there. As a society, we must take steps to include everyone in our cultural conversation. It's a moral, civic, and cultural responsibility." That pledge by the Arts Council is backed by hard cash and years of commitment. And it's also a deliberate choice to go beyond the requirements of the 2010 Equality Act. And I'm going to talk a lot this evening about choices. Museums and our heritage sites are a vital component of our national culture, places to immerse visitors in great stories and treasures that help us to understand our past, present, and future. All the more important, therefore, that they adequately support disabled people to both work in the industry and to create equality of experience for disabled visitors. I recently contributed to the 2018 State of Museum Access report that was produced by Stage Text and Vocalize and is available on both their websites. It's packed with examples of best access practice from museums across the UK, of which the sector should feel proud and celebrate. But the report also reveals some disturbing facts. For example, 1 in 5 of our museums offer no access information on their websites whatsoever. As access starts before any visit takes place, and often online, this sends a message akin to "we're closed" to a fifth of our population who are disabled. Consistency and reliability of access information, both important factors to build trust with disabled visitors, are also revealed to be patchy across the sector. My own experience supports that. Museum visits are frequently compromised by display cabinets that I can't see into. For example, at the recent 250th birthday exhibition at the Royal Academy of Arts, for which I paid full entry, and the display cabinets were about that height. No chance that I could see into those. Or indeed the very poor level of access offered by the recently completed lottery refurbishment of Kettle's Yard in Cambridge. I couldn't even get into the cafe and was handed an iPad to see the core collection highlights. These acts of exclusion are choices, and they're often easily avoidable with just a bit more consideration of visitors' needs or consulting groups with expertise, such as the museum's Disability Cooperative Network. During the lovely warm weather last week, my partner and I visited the National Trust's flagship property at Stowe in Buckinghamshire. On arrival, I was told there was no recommended access route, there was no electric scooter that I could hire for the day, and the only thing that was available was a pre-bookable golf buggy, which I couldn't have transferred into, nor could I have driven. So, as I'm still relatively fit, we paid our money and took our chances. Whilst the landscape is step-free, there's considerable distances to cross, big gradients to climb, and the surface was uneven at best and in places very challenging. In fact, my partner, Tim, did his knee in pushing me around, and whilst we both admired the beauty of the place, left completely exhausted. Will I return? Probably not. That lack of access information and provision at Stowe demonstrate both attitudinal and physical discrimination, but ultimately they were both choices by the National Trust. But I detect a shift is taking place in even the most conservative and surprising of places. The Archbishop of Canterbury is on record recently stating that heritage considerations can no longer be a barrier to access in the buildings of the Church of England. Restrictions on adapting historic buildings and reasonable adjustments are often cited as reasons not to make access improvements. So the Archbishop's intervention represents a considerable shift by placing access for the first time ahead of heritage considerations. For someone like me, that's really exciting news. And there is also a very good example of such an approach in action at a truly historic building. 15 years ago, I visited Buckingham Palace, which at that time was barely accessible, using a series of back doors, improvised ramps, and lifts. Returning there recently, I was delighted to find daring adaptations made to the fabric of the building that prioritized access through the front door, demonstrating that the authorities there had fully understood the need to make that establishment welcome all members of society. A great choice, and perhaps made in tandem with the increasing mobility requirements of Her Majesty. But there are also rewards for these decisions. There are 13 million disabled people in the UK, 20% of our national workforce, with a combined spending power of over 250 billion, the so-called purple pound. And that figure is growing 14% annually. Whilst the business case for inclusion is surely overwhelming, the arts and heritage sectors have been slow to recognise it. And that's where I come in as the government's first disability champion for arts and culture, a role that covers the arts, museums and film. The government realises it needs assistance to tackle the issues disabled people face as consumers across a range of industries, from retail to airports. Champions don't work for nor represent the government. We are rather free agents of change. Consequently, I've outlined 3 priorities to better support disabled people across the cultural industry, aimed at both the sector itself and the government. I want to address the lack of training opportunities and entry points for disabled talent. I want to correct the underrepresentation in employment and governance structures of disabled people. And finally, I want to ensure equality of experience for audiences. These priorities are shaped by my own personal experience of the arts and broadcasting industries over 30 years, which has offered me, as a disabled individual, few support mechanisms, frequent discrimination, and perhaps crucially, no role models to follow. I began my career in the late 1980s, during the first big moment of equal representation when broadcasters woke up to their lack of on- and off-screen diversity. I was Channel 4's first disabled production trainee, and for about a decade, I was the go-to action TV presenter in a wheelchair. But all of this was brought to a premature halt in the 90s, after an edition at the BBC where I was told the Blue Peter audience are not yet ready for a presenter with a disability. Much later on, I had to withdraw from a recruitment process, having been shortlisted to become chief executive of Oxford Playhouse, a building without a single accessible space in which I could be interviewed. 20 years apart, both these experiences conveyed the same message. So I'm determined that the next generation of disabled talent don't have to endure these kind of experiences. To that end, I'm bringing together a ministerial roundtable later this year, hosted by DCMS and DWP, ministers, and attended by all 4 UK arts councils, British Film Institute and the Heritage Lottery Fund. I'll be advocating for the creation of a single national disabled person's access card, free to the user, with standardised benefits at any funded venue or attraction. And I aim to establish a charter that outlines minimum service expectations for cultural service providers in return for public subsidy that offers disabled audiences and visitors clearly defined rights. Essentially, ladies and gentlemen, this is all about ensuring disabled people are welcomed and valued. For me, there are just 3 short words that represent the scale of the journey so far. Britain's got talent. Audiences of 11 million witnessed 2 exceptionally talented disabled comedians, Lost Voice Guy and Robert White, coming first and second on Britain's biggest TV show. Choices were made by ITV to feature both those artists. Choices that led to altering more perceptions of disability in this country than anything since the 2012 Paralympics. Simon Cowell, of all people, has raised the stakes. And that's precisely what is now required of us. We have to lead beyond the requirements of the Equality Act to go beyond reasonable adjustments. I would urge you all to join me in offering leadership in whatever sector you belong to ensure poor training, rubbish access, and enduring discrimination in arts and heritage industries are finally banished to the past. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you, Andrew, for an excellent start to our evening. I think at this point, because you've got to go in a few minutes, may I ask if there's any questions? Well, at the end, we'll have, after all the panellists have spoken, we'll have a collective discussion, which sadly Andrew can't be here for. But does anyone have any particular questions or observations or reflections on what he just said, which was some pretty powerful words for anyone involved in arts, culture, or heritage? And if not, we'll move on. But it would be great to hear people's reflections on that. I'm glad you mentioned my brother Simon in your talk, but that was terrific. That's done wonderful things for disability. Are there any points anyone had that, or any reflections from your own organisations about how well or not the sector might be doing?
Hello, I'm Peter Ayres from the Church Conservation Trust, and my reflection is that we clearly aren't thinking about it properly in any way, and genuinely sort of, because it's complicated and perceived as expensive to think this through, it sort of prevents us going further in some ways to think about how these problems are solved in terms of visitors to what we've got a collection of very remote rural sites of ancient buildings, and we haven't got that in our frame of reference enough. So I think you've laid down a really good challenge to us to really work out how best we can introduce these themes into our thinking. I think it starts with us awareness and training really about how to confront what is quite a tricky situation, but ultimately solvable in some way to make as many people able to visit as possible.
Well, do you have a specific comment on was it the Archbishop of Canterbury who made a point about the hierarchy of, human needs over the heritage? I mean, this is
no, absolutely. But then it's great
stuff.
Well, it is, but it's about understanding the churches in particular. the only way they're going to survive in society is if they're relevant and useful to society in some way. In order to do that, you've got to have people come into them.
Yeah.
So you've got to appeal to the broadest possible audience that you can, and access is one of those. Going into them is a really helpful thing to do. Yeah. So I think that they've always adapted and changed to the needs of society over time, so there's no reason why that shouldn't carry on. It's how you go about the decision-making to do it. But where there's a will, there's generally a way to do it.
And if I might add, that in all the conversations I'm having with government and funding agencies, at no point have I asked for more money for anything. I'm asking for a reallocation of existing resources. So you're absolutely right, this stuff isn't cheap. But actually, I think the funding is already there. It's just how you allocate it. And I'm very hopeful, actually, that the government will be bringing forward a champion for the heritage and countryside in the new year. I don't know if they're definitely going to go ahead with that. My area is arts and culture, but I'm very hopeful that a heritage champion will be running, because I think it would be very useful for all of you.
I'd agree with that.
Oh, there's one question back there if we've got time. Thank you very much. Yeah, if you could say your name and where you're from.
Hi, I'm Georgie Holmeskelson. I'm from the National Trust. So I thought I should respond. It was an entirely fair criticism by the sounds of your experience, and I'm sorry that was the case. One of the challenges that we have is ensuring consistency of experience and consistency of access and so forth at all of our sites. And that is something I will feed back. And I was struck by your comments around it not just being about the physical access on the ground, but also the information that's available in advance. And that's something that I feel should be relatively easy, perhaps, to resolve, and something that perhaps we could do with thinking more about. So thank you for your comments, which I will.
My pleasure. Well, the one thing I would say is I've visited, I think it's an English heritage site, Fountains Abbey, last year, and you could get an electric wheelchair that I could use to get around the estate, whereas at Stowe, which is a similar size, you couldn't. And a golf buggy, I'm sure, assists with elderly people with perhaps more limited mobility problems, but for somebody like me, absolutely no help at all.
Thank you, Georgina. Oh, there's one more point here. Thank you.
I'm Yannis Athanasiou. I'm a researcher from Goldsmiths University, but I used to be the lead of education department for Shape Arts. So I work a lot with the disability sector, and in terms of the diversifying, I see the point that was quite difficult. There are ways of finding ways of diversifying the audiences in the heritage sector. And there are very good examples, a good practice around the sector, especially in the last years. I just have to try to make one reflection and at the same time question in terms of diversifying the workforce. And in that area, I see the more challenges, in my view, because I feel sometimes that specific disability groups are more privileged than other disability groups. And one particular example is people with mental health problems. And we know, according to the disability legislation, mental health is a disability. Exactly. So my question is, do we have any thinking about this huge area of people who might suffer of any mental health condition? And what can we do for the vast majority of disabled people who come from that specific particular group? That's my key question.
I can't answer for the heritage sector, but certainly within arts, I'm seeing considerable resources going into supporting people with learning disabilities. For example, the Hijinks company in Wales, who are supported by Arts Council of Wales, and in fact have just done a tour of China, are entirely made up of a company of people with learning difficulties. And so I think, certainly in my approach as champion, I look at it all as the same thing, whether it's physical disabilities, neurodiversity, learning disabilities, deaf, whatever. And so I don't make that distinction, but I am very aware that we need to ensure that there's equality of access for everyone, and that's the approach that I take. And I think your point about employment is really important, because in England, the level of employment of disabled people in the arts sector is 4%. In Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, it's about 2%. in comparison to the education sector, that's 12%. So the arts, being a very subsidised model, is not carrying its weight, and we need to do a lot of work around that area.
Thank you. One last question, I think, and then we need to move on. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Becky Morris, and I'm the lead for the Disability Cooperative Network in Heritage. And what we do is we are championing and supporting the sector in respect to inclusive practice in the service provision, but also in the workforce. And there was just something I wanted to add about the workforce, is that we were recently part of the Westminster Achievability Commission report on neurodiverse voices in respect to the recruitment and retention barriers within the workplace. But also we're becoming increasingly aware of the importance of having accessible toilets, but also accessible office spaces. So it's about enabling the physical barriers to be reduced, but also in terms of awareness training and also understanding the barriers. We hold informal meetups, we do. Our first one was at the Natural History Museum about the Disability Confidence Scheme. And not only were we completely booked out in about 2 weeks, but also it was very much clear that the sector wanted change, but often it's those particular elements in respect to accessible offices and also in regards to the barriers as produced by the WAC report that we are now concentrating on as a network. So it was just a bit of a comment in relation to the previous question.
Thank you. Any more to add? I mean, presumably you totally agreed with that, obviously.
Yes, completely.
Because,
completely.
Office
yeah.
is the big issue about workforces.
Absolutely, and I would absolutely, recommend that the sector beats its path to Becky's door.
Absolutely.
Because she's doing a lot of very important and good work in the sector.
Thank you, Andrew. I think you need to head off.
Yes,
don't
I do.
So I think we'll say
thank
you once again for your excellent start. Now, I think what we'll do is we'll have each of our panellists speaking, and some panellists have brought images to show on the screen. So there's a clicker to push forward. And I also ought to add, I think you've been asked to talk for no more than 6 minutes or something like that. So I have got a clock, and I'll wave my hands if I think you've overstayed your 6 minutes, but we're looking forward to hearing from you. And just while we rearrange things, I think, Corin, you're going to... Do you want to stand here? Oh, there we are. There's a lectern coming. Excellent.
Yeah?
So while you make your way over... Actually, you better take this, hadn't you?
I will. I'll take the clicker.
I'll introduce you. I've got a... Corin Fowler is here to talk about the Colonial Countryside Project. This is National Trust... Again, this is National Trust work that's going on. It's an Arts Council England and HLF-funded project looking at the reinterpretation of various National Trust properties. We've heard of some this evening already. And Corin is Associate Professor at the University of Leicester and Director of the Centre for New Writing. And her book, Green Unpleasant Land, Creative Responses to Rural England's Colonial Connections, is out next year. Thank you, Corin.
Oh, it works. So, first of all, I just wanted to mention that I'm really happy to be speaking here beside Margot, whose project, East India Company at Home, was a big inspiration behind this project, and she's done some wonderful things that I'm sure she'll talk about later. So, just 7 days ago, a 10-year-old child called Zaskia wrote a piece in response to a miniature of Tipu Sultan that she'd seen at Chalkot Park. And her parents come from India, and I think it really showed in all the best kind of ways in this little piece that she wrote and read out there in Chalkot Park. I thought, she's obviously writing as Tipu Sultan here. She would have been here to read it in person, by the way, but she's having her tonsils out. And her mother would have let her come too. I fought hard for my country's liberty. I planned for India's future, making factories. I tried to make trade routes with the outside world. I set up the silk trade in China. Even though I was rich and dressed splendidly, I wanted the best for India. I fought tirelessly for my country. I led armies into battle against the East India Company. The British came to conquer, but their plans were soon delayed. Their armies battled against mighty warriors. The battlefield was tarnished with enemy blood. I fought as a tiger. I famously said, better to live one day as a tiger than your whole life as a sheep. Unfortunately, 10,000 of my people died. I died. We died fighting for India. So to explain about my project, it's a child-led history and writing project working with 100 children, a whole bunch of amazing historians, and also in partnership, of course, with the National Trust. And I just wanted to mention only briefly a couple of the links to empire that some of these houses which are participating in the project have. Basildon Park is one of the properties that's participating. That was owned by Francis Sykes, and he made a fortune with the East India Company. And then he came back and settled in the valley where that house is, which was once known as England's Hindustan. There's Buckland Abbey, which was the home of Francis Drake. And Francis Drake, if anyone's read The Black Tudors, sailed with an African circumnavigator called Diego, who helped him to get lots of gold because he had intelligence from the opposition. But they also sailed with an African woman named Maria, who they dumped on an island in Indonesia without a water source because she was heavily pregnant. Then there's Durham Park. So that was the home of one of the most important colonial administrators of his generation. And you may have seen staircases there, one of black walnut, one of red cedar, and they were the result of gifts that people used to give him in exchange, they hoped, for influence. Another participating property is Penrhyn Castle, and the historian Marion Gwynn calls that whole estate a slavery landscape, because its roads, its ports, its infrastructure, its slate fences were paid for through 300 years of owning sugar plantations in Jamaica. There's also a picture there of Kedleston Hall, one of the properties that's participating, which was home of Curzon, the Viceroy of India. Just to explain how this project works very briefly, we give a history lesson to the children, and there is a little fragment, number 1, from one of our history sessions. It is indeed the Curzons riding on an elephant during the Delhi Durbar, and the children have done thought bubbles there. So Lady Curzon is saying, well, this is nice, and the Indians in the crowd are saying, we need to attack. The children then go and give their parents a history lesson, and the parents do homework. So number 2 is a picture of a child proudly holding up his mother's homework that he's brought back. The third picture is just a picture taken during a visit. So the children form a child advisory board to each of the country houses involved, and they go and visit with a writer. They produce some of the writing. I've given you an example of it here. And then they keep visiting, and they are interacting a lot with volunteers. The fourth picture is of a school in Toxteth, which has changed its curriculum alongside 5 other schools in Liverpool to match the project and to link up with Speak Hall. And then the 5th picture is of an amazing child called Anna, who did a 2-minute video, which I put on Twitter, and it got 7,300 views in 10 days. And it was partly because of the amazing way that she explained, and compelling way that she explained, an idealised depiction of a sugar plantation in Penrhyn Castle. One of the things that we're doing is reverse mentoring schemes. So, for example, in Penrhyn Castle, the guides give their usual tour, the children go round, write notes, act as critical friends, and help the guides to write a much more stimulating and interesting tour for children, but also one which integrates the Jamaican connection in Penrhyn Castle. And we have them in some of the other houses just starting up as well. One of the obviously important aspects of the project is that we want these children, the 100 who are participating, to think of themselves as leaders as the next generation archivists, of curators, historians, writers, and so on. So this is all a very important part of the process as we work with them over the next 5 years. And just to conclude, David Olusoga, over the weekend, he was just pointing out that 1 in every 3 school children is BME, or my ethnic minority child. And that may not be the world that you or I grew up in necessarily, although for some of us it was, but it's certainly the world that our children and grandchildren are growing up in. And as he said in that article, demographics is destiny, and I think that this is one of the ways that we can make heritage relevant to the next generation. I'll leave the clicker here.
Brilliant.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Corinne. So store up your observations and questions for a little bit later. We'll listen to other panellists first and then open it up to the floor for discussion. I'd like to invite Abigail Flack to go and assume the lectern and actually flick it forward to your title page, if you would, please. Abigail is Collections Officer at the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, where she works on the Multaka Oxford project, which is about involving the local community and exploring the way collections can be used to interpret and tell diverse stories and views in inclusive ways. Over to you, Abby.
Okay, so a little bit about the project. So it's called Multaka Oxford. Multaka is Arabic for meeting point, and it's all about how we can use museums and their collections as a meeting point for integration and for, many things really. We feed it into pretty much every level of the project. So it's a collaborative project working across the Pitt Rivers Museum where I work and the Museum for the History of Science, and we're supported by the Esme Fairbairn Collections Fund. So here's a quick sort of tagline for us. So we create inclusive volunteer opportunities and use museums and collections as a meeting point for bringing people together. The project and its name was inspired by a project in Berlin, which was all about using refugees and recent arrivals in Berlin as tour guides throughout their state museums. So we kind of looked at that, and that sort of tied in with a lot of the community engagement work that was already being done through our engagement department, and we kind of realised a good meeting point actually between a lot of the partnerships that had been developed. We're saying, well, actually what we could really use is work experience opportunities within a museum, because that will be something different, it will be something really engaging. And then the museums thought, well, yeah, and actually, we would all get a great amount out of that. So here's a few sort of reasons why the museum's doing the project. So we're developing a more inclusive visitor profile and experience of our museums, enhancing some of our understanding and narratives to our collections. We're developing and constantly adapting our processes to make them more collaborative. We're kind of developing new ways of communicating information about our collections. And we're also kind of reanalyzing and challenging some of our embedded volunteer recruitment processes, and looking at ways that we can make those more inclusive by the end of the project. And again, just generally looking at championing more collaborative, socially engaged practice across the whole of the museums. So these are our key community partners who support us, and these are actually a lot of our channels into the programme. So we recruit volunteers through our partner organisations, particularly Asylum Welcome and Refugee Resource, and that is basically the primary way that we are able to target our resources. And also key members from all of these organisations sit on a community advisory panel, and they sit alongside other project collaborators and volunteers themselves, and they advise us at all levels of the project. So we have our steering group, which is made up of directors and all of that kind of thing, but then we also have our community advisory panel, who we also report to and who also give us critical feedback. So that we really feel like our sort of community partnerships are a driving factor of the project. So quickly, the project team. So there's me, my my partner officer for the History of Science Museum, Rana, and our overarching coordinator, Rachel. And we also have our community ambassador, Nuha. So she was involved right at the start. She was one of the key members of the community, really saying, "Hey, isn't there more we can do with the museums? Can't we find a project?" And our project manager was able to start up a slightly separate pilot programme called Community Ambassadors, where she was able to apply for some money from the university's Equality and Diversity Fund to actually pay members of the community for their time. So very often museums have these key partnerships within communities, and that time, whilst is hugely valuable, is not actually often paid. So Nuha was so instrumental that we found a way to pay her for her work with us. And here's a group photo of some of us all together and our volunteers. So they all come from a range of backgrounds, and as much as possible, we really try and tailor their volunteer experience and what they do and what skills they want to build around them. We make a point of not making any assumptions about what people's interests or knowledge base might be based on either where they're from or their religion or anything like that. We very much try as much as possible to let them steer their kind of journey. So I'm going to talk a little bit more now about the collection itself, which is what I work on. So we've got, I'm working on a collection of they're not really Arabic textiles, but they're textiles from across the Middle East and North Africa. And then at the History of Science, there's Islamic scientific instruments. That's an astrolabe, if anyone knows anything about those. So the collection I work with was actually donated to the museum this year by a lady called Jenny Balfour-Paul. She travelled quite widely around, the whole world, really, around sort of the 70s and 80s, and developed a special interest in indigo dyeing and textile manufacture techniques. So she donated around 100 objects at the start of this year, which was highlighted as the collection that we would base all of our volunteer activity at the Pit Rivers around. So there's a quote from her about how she kind of feels about giving things back to the museum and to the countries where she purchased things originally. And just generally about how good it is to have different points of view. So there's a few images of pieces, and here's a quick look at the sort of things that we've been doing. So we run sort of group sessions where we get hands-on with objects. That's really at the core of everything we do. There's, so that's History of Science with the director, and hands-on there at the Pit Rivers with some of the textiles there. So I'm very keen that everyone that comes to me, no matter what they want to volunteer, even if they turn around and say, I don't care about the collections, I want to learn admin skills, and we do facilitate that, I still say, no, they're going to come and have some object handling training, and they're going to get hands-on with objects, because I think that's just kind of really key. So here's another sort of lovely group session that we've had. We've got some volunteers we've got one in particular who's a really keen photographer, so we've been letting him loose with our collections to take his own photos, and then he did some training with me about sort of how we take our boring object photos, which is the example on this side here. Our participants, they write blogs in multiple languages, multiple formats, different styles. We've had poetry, creative writing, more research pieces, lots of things. And then one that I really focus on is the core work, which is the work of the database. So this is what I spend a lot of my time on, which is just physically accessioning this collection and getting it onto our museum database, which is our primary source of information for our collections and will be the primary source of our information for the collections whenever anyone comes to look at any of these pieces. So my real sort of goal is to work with volunteers, so volunteers who are interested in those kind of processes. They will come and do one-on-one training with me, and I will talk them through the boring intricacies of a database. Even just the basics of providing the object measurements for me. We've got one girl who absolutely loves doing that. I think she really likes practicing sort of getting all of the numbers and stuff right and inputting them. And then we've also got space. I add in any research that volunteers have gone away and done, any blog post or anything that we've generated. I make sure that all of it is collected and listed actually physically onto our database so that it's all there. And I think that's the really great thing about working with a collection that's right at the start of its journey into the museum. It means that this kind of collaborative approach is it's now a really core part of the collection's biography now, going forward. We also have our volunteers talking about objects at events, and we actually support them in hosting events for their wider community. So actually, letting them know that the museum is their space just as much, and we try and facilitate family days and things like that as much as possible. And then finally, we'll have, I'm sort of working with volunteers towards a display at the Pit Rivers, which should showcase a lot of our kind of values within the project. So they'll be supported to sort of help with all levels of it. It's only in one case, so sort of helping to manage the expectations as well. Already I've had suggestions of a magic rotating plinth and things like that. So it's sort of all working together with the whole, they'll work with the technicians, they'll work with our conservation team as well, just to kind of see what goes into putting an exhibition together. So I just wanted to end with really the kind of core thing and why we're doing this, which is the volunteers. They're at the heart of what we do. So a lot of the reasons they do it, to gain skills for future employment, to refresh existing skills. The sort of number one thing is often to improve their English. Integration and having somewhere to socialise is a really key thing for a lot of them. Just meeting people from different places, and really kind of, I think people really get a lot out of those kind of intercultural dialogues. To get a reference, that's a really, really important one for people. Learning more about their own and other cultures, and actually to share their own knowledge and their own stories, and you can really watch their people's confidence bloom as they've kind of practiced presentations about something they've researched, and it's really lovely. So I'll finally end on a few quotes. So there's one at the top. I'm learning the history of Syria. I've been reading books about history, silk factories, new things, learning how Syrians make and sell. It's important to learn this. This is my country. The biggest change for me has been my English has got better. Here I talk more, I listen more. At home I go home and speak Arabic, but here in the museum I speak, I listen, I learn. At home I am bored. Today is not a boring day. Today is happy. Thank you for today. Today is mine. It's about me. I'm my own person. It's not about my husband. I really enjoyed meeting different people from different backgrounds. When the objects are explained to you like this, you appreciate it more. And I think that's kind of it from me, yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Abigail. Thank you for that inspiring project about a use of a museum collection. And we'll come back to museums in particular, I guess, in the discussion. Now, some of you might be on your phones because you're tweeting. And if you're not and you want to tweet, I think we've got a hashtag Heritage Debate, all one word. So feel free to do that as we go along. But we'll move quickly on to our next speaker. You're going to stay there, Jonathan. So Jonathan Badial is Head of Communication at Universal Music UK, formerly Policy Advisor to Ed Vaizey and Matt Hancock when they were at DCMS. And his work has therefore touched on all aspects of UK cultural policy, but he has particular interest, obviously, in his new role in music and in the British urban music scene. So thank you, Jonathan.
No problems. Is the mic working at the back?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Thank you for the intro. So my name's Jonathan, and I'm currently working at Universal Music. For those of you that don't know, Universal is the UK's leading music company. We're home to many artists from Shaku, Cannon Mason, did the Royal Wedding, Sam Smith, Drake, Taylor Swift. You get the picture. I'd just like to say a huge thanks to Lizzie for inviting me to speak tonight. Lizzie and I work together at DCMS. She's a fantastic advocate for your sector, and I can say with certain authority that the government's loss was definitely your sector's gain. So, as I say, before joining Universal, I spent 5 years working for the government ministers Ed Vaizey and Matt Hancock. Does everyone know who they are? Yeah. Fans, not fans? Yeah. All fans, good. Advising them on all things cultural and digital, and it was pretty much diversity and widening participation in the arts that really caught my attention. Today I also sit on the board of the Roundhouse here in London and the Black Country Living Museum, which is one of the UK's largest open-air museums, and also where I grew up and went to school. So I haven't got a presentation as such, but I'd just like to make 2 brief points. The first one is on workforces, and the second will be on spaces. So there's one thing I'm certain of from my previous job, but also in the new job. If you don't have diverse staff, you definitely won't get diverse audiences. So the question, how do you start? How do you get diverse staff through the door at a junior level? Well, from my experience, you need to recruit in the right places. So that doesn't mean putting adverts in the Times, quite frankly. You need to get rid of any remaining unpaid internships. And I know there's been lots of progress made already, but I'm aware of a number still out there. And maybe just as importantly, you all need to get out into schools, talking to young people about your sector, but also the different careers that are available. I'm shocked as someone who works in music how many people, for example, don't know you can work in music and not be Taylor Swift. It blows my mind. So I know progress has been made here, but getting diverse people through the door is very much just the first step. And I just want to mention some stuff on inclusivity. So if your organisation is not inclusive, if it's not putting in place development plans, mentoring, coaching, those junior staff who you've worked so hard to get through the door in the first place will absolutely struggle to climb the ladder into more senior roles. And ultimately, I'm sure you're all aware, if the management, if the leadership is not diverse, your progress will falter, no doubt about that. And here's an easy win, I think, for most of you in the room with your boards. So I'm proud that at the Roundhouse we've been recruiting young trustees to the full board for many years. I think it first started in 2005. And when I say young, I mean actually young. So I like to think I'm young, but these are actual teenagers who sit on the full board making decisions and voting on policies that are going to affect, a brilliant organisation. And they're not just there for the sake of it. I mean, I can speak from experience, right? They actually do bring fresh thinking, new ideas. They'll talk to you about things you've never even heard of. And that worries me to an extent, but it's just so important, So that's my first point, workforces, and hopefully we can touch on a bit more of the detail in the debate. My second point is about spaces. Now, I'm sure everyone in this room will be aware that youth clubs, creativity in schools are pretty much decimated, on the decline. Crime hitting frightening levels, not just in London, but across all the major cities in the UK, and societies have been left behind. Now, I know the causes are complex and the solutions are obviously scarce, but what I do know is that young people love being creative, but what they don't have is the space to be creative. And I think some of you in this room today can probably be providers of that. I thought David Jubb, for those of you that don't know, he runs the Battersea Arts Centre, put it brilliantly in a recent article when he said, for many years, the conventional method of inviting people to engage with culture has been to say, come and join in with what we're doing. But what about if people want to be creative in different ways, particularly young people? They don't just want to go to a gallery to look at art, right? So ask yourself this. What capability do your organisations, what capability do they have to open your doors to different forms of creativity and innovation? I'd suggest it's probably more than you think. My favourite example of this was a recent collaboration I helped forge between the National Portrait Gallery and the Mercury Prize-nominated Graham MC, novelist. That is novelist. Does anyone know who novelist is? It's really important. I know you did, but does anyone else? Put your hand up if... Cool. That's what I expected, and I'm glad you said that. So it was actually a young people's private view, which saw, I think, around over 250 young people, aged 14 to 21, basically were allowed in the gallery after hours one evening. And guess what? The audience was diverse, but the audience was also very new. And it was actually a lot easier than you think. We basically brought together a figure who widely appeals to young people with an organisation who are desperately seeking to attract new audiences. And the result even surprised me. I caught up with the gallery earlier this week to tell them I was doing this, just to see if they had any extra information for me to share with you. And they told me that a handful, I think around 10, of people who attended the gallery that night just to see Novelist have since joined up as young associates of the gallery, and they'll probably be there for the rest of their lives in some form or guise. Of course, they love the collaboration. Of course, they love the exclusive performance by one of our best artists, but they also love the gallery for what it is, right? They love the space, they love the portraiture, they love the creative offer. They just didn't know that that place was for them. What it needed was a vehicle to get them in there in the first place, right? So their perceptions that the gallery was not for them were literally turned inside out. So in summary, my challenge to you, and it might not apply to all of you in the room, is to be radical in this area. Let young people use your space and experience creativity and innovation in their way, not just yours. So I'll leave you with that thought, and hopefully we can pick up on some of the points as the evening goes on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Can we move on now to Errol? Are you going to present from the chair or the lectern?
Yeah.
Errol Francis is Chief Executive and Artistic Director of Culture and, a hugely respected leader in the fields of community engagement and activism around mental health and the arts. And I think you're an artist in your own right, an artistic director as well. And so you're going to talk this evening about what Culture and has been doing. A particular project I think you're going to talk about is the new museum school, among other things.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Thanks so much for the invitation. I do want to address the question that's been posed for this event directly, which is connecting more diverse audiences with heritage, and particularly around youth, class and cultural diversity, by looking at the work that we do at Culture and we've been around for quite a while, since the late 80s, and our mission is to open up arts and heritage sectors to more diverse talent and to expand audiences. And I'm totally with Jonathan there about the link between these two things, that if you want to expand audiences, you've got to have fresh talent. You know, you can't have fresh talent that's going to be trotting out the same thing. So we're absolutely committed to that, and we do that through two main work strands, which is our public programming, commissioning new works of art, and through our workforce education and training. So just in terms of the curatorial and commissioning side of things, one of the things that we believe in, actually, is that this distinction between arts and heritage is false, actually, in the sense that contemporary art is our heritage of tomorrow. And as Jonathan was saying there, a collection like the National Portrait Gallery, how do you get people to engage with it? Well, you put a contemporary artist in it, right? And so commissioning new work is absolutely important to us. We've done a number of public programs over the last few years, and this is our latest one that we're developing. It's a new play by a rising star, Rachel Ofori. She's developing this fantastic new work that we've been working with Hackney Empire, which we regard as a heritage space. I mean, it's a Victorian music hall. It does wonderful community engagement. And Rachel's writing a new play about gentrification in London and how this is working on a cultural level. So we absolutely think that once this is finished, why not could it be performed in a museum space? It could be performed in a music hall. It could be performed in a regular theatre. Really, I think that this kind of thing is fluid, and this is what we need to do to open up audiences. But our big flagship programme that we have just started, the new museum school, and this is the class of 2018. Very, very proud of all these young people from diverse backgrounds. We've heard previously about the composition of the workforce. We're very alarmed about this. It seems to be getting worse, actually, diversity in the arts and heritage workforce. We heard this year from this panic report, that they estimated 2.7% BAME workforce. That's a worse number than was reported about a decade ago by Maurice Davis, who's a very respected researcher in this field. So we really do have to get on with this, and we're very proud of this new group of people. They started with us just last month. 16 traineeships that are going to be in various heritage organisations, and we have a diverse demographic in terms of race, class, gender, disability and sexuality. The new museum school programme involves a one-year traineeship at leading museums. National Trust is one of our partners. Royal Museums Greenwich is another. There's a focus on digital and conservation skills. The comment earlier about working for free absolutely needs to be addressed, because that's one of the disadvantages in the sector. People who can afford to self-fund themselves for entry-level I've forgotten the word. Internships, that's the word I was looking for. And this is a paid London Living Wage bursary, and alongside this practical experience, people get accredited diploma in cultural heritage. And these are the partners that we have. And from Keats House, the Royal Academy, the Royal Collection Trust, smaller museums like Brent, English Heritage, I've mentioned the Royal Museums, Shape Arts, somebody from there, South Bank, and so on. So what we're really pleased about, that there are elements of the sector that feel that this is something that need to act on, and they're doing something about it. And over the next 2 years, 34 traineeships, and this is the talent of tomorrow that is going to be influencing the arts and heritage content. And as said previously, these guys are going to come up with ideas that we couldn't possibly think of, and this is what we need to influence programmes and expand audiences. But I also wanted to touch on what some of our partners are doing. We had a speaker from the National Trust, and I wanted to kind of flip the viewpoint here from being sort of a manager to being an audience, me as an audience, if you like. And this particular programme completely shattered my image of the National Trust, and I think that that's the stuff that people want to do. So what this picture is a gay club that existed in Covent Garden, not far from here, in Endell Street, in the mid-1930s, called the Caravan Club. And what was done in 2017, the 50th anniversary of the decriminalisation of homosexuality, what the National Archives and the National Trust did was to recreate this space in a shop that's near here called Freud, which is roughly where the club was, and to actually do this through archival documents. Now, I wouldn't have gone to the National Archives to see this, actually, if they just said, oh, look, here are some police records about what was going on in the 1930s. But to actually bring it alive in a space there, to recreate the space and to serve cocktails and have lovely, talk and all the rest of it was absolutely fantastic. It brought a new audience. It was a diverse audience in terms of sexuality, race, and so forth. And crucially, I think it was off-site. And I think there's this thing about intangible heritage. I think that we get too hung up on objects and rather than experience. And this is a really powerful way of engaging people. And the next example that I want to give, I think, is even more. It's another National Trust example, and so here we have a photograph which really does exemplify the cold isolation of objects. So the object in this case is a very beautiful Tudor house that was the oldest house in Hackney. It was going to be demolished in the late 1980s. It was saved by the National Trust, and Sutton House Queered is the programme that was put on there. Now, the queer programme has absolutely nothing to do with the objects in there. This is of getting beyond the object. This was engaging people around London, not just Hackney, in an experience about heritage, gay experience, or gay life as heritage, as experience. And it was actually at other National Trust sites that were being opened up in this programme. One of the events they did later on. But Sutton House Queered, they had a whole year of activities there, LGBTQ activities, that, as I say, were not about necessarily responding to the object, but using the museum or the heritage site as a space for cultural experience, a space for actually forming heritage. And I think this is a really radical approach, and I think that museums could learn from this as well, that it's not just about the objects. And I think even the example there at the NPG there, that the initial thing is not about the portraits itself, but it's about a cultural experience and using the museum as a space for that. And I'll just end actually by the etymology of the word museum has nothing to do with objects. It's a temple for the muses. It's a place to think. And I think that we need to get back to that as a way of engaging audiences. And I think that in terms of answering the question, that's the example I'd like to leave you with. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Errol. That was wonderful. We've got two more speakers before we open it up to the floor. Sasha Cowd from Royal Museums Greenwich, who runs the LGBTQ History Month there and is involved in the Queering Museums Network and the London Pride annual event. If you flick the slide, your name comes up. Oh, no.
Oh,
thank you. Excellent. There we go. Over to you. Thank you.
Awesome. So it's awesome to be here, and also to follow two speakers, so Errol and Jonathan, who've really touched on kind of what I'm going on about too, about spaces. I think this is about creating spaces for different communities and diverse audiences. Don't cringe too much. I'm about to start with some definitions. I promise it gets more interesting as pictures and stuff. But before I talk, I do want to start speaking about a few words I'm going to use because I always presume people know what these words mean and they can be kind of barriers to understanding. So I'm going to say LGBTQ plus a lot. It's a lot of letters, I know. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer and questioning, and all other sexual and gender identities that are non-heteronormative, so non-heterosexual. I'm going to say queer a lot, and queer is quite a divisive term. Some people hate it. It has been an insult. It's been a slur. It's been taken back by a lot of the community to be a sense of identity. It's also a verb, and I'm going to be using it as a verb a lot. How do you queer a space? I guess you could youth a space. You can do all kinds of things to a space, but I'm going to be talking about queering. And the other one is cisgender. A lot of you come across the term transgender, but you may more recently have come across the term cisgender, which refers to when your birth, the gender that you are assigned at birth, matches that which you are living. So I define as cisgender. I'm a gay cisgender man. So if I use those terms and you get confused or I use anything else, just ask what I'm going on about. So I'm really self-referential, and I've put my own tweet up massively, so I apologise for that. But simply because when I was madly trying to come up with this presentation, the analogy of finding a chair at the table sort of came together with something I was moaning about, which is basically the situation with trying to put forward a queer, positive agenda in museums. So often, it's like you're looking at this chair, and it's a chair, it looks like a chair, but they didn't have chairs back then. It's like, but it's a chair. I mean, this is definitely a chair. I saw someone sitting in the chair. You can't prove it. And then you get to the point where it does become straight until proven guilty, where it's conjecture, slander, hearsay. How dare you say that this has any queer besmirchment on it whatsoever? So I'm going to try not to moan too much, but I am putting forward basically 4 things that get in the way of queering spaces. They get in the way of bringing queer audiences, LGBTQ plus audiences, into your heritage sites and museums and keeping them there. They're also the things that when you are working as a queer museum professional are barriers to you feeling safe and happy working there too. So there are no LGBTQ stories in our site and collection. I hear some version of this all the time. When I started at Royal Museums Greenwich, there were categorically No queer stories. It's such a shame. They're just not there. We're talking the Navy, guys. We're talking cross-dressing pirates. We're talking, I mean, come on, just look. Just look a little bit closer. This is a painting by Evelyn de Morgan. I'm obsessed with mermaids. If you follow me on Twitter, I apologize profusely for that. But this is a painting by Evelyn de Morgan called Sea Maidens. She's painted the model Jane... Oh, look at me forgetting my words. Anyway, she painted this one particular model obsessively over and over again in her career and was actually buried next to her alongside her husband. But do we have a panel that says that? No, of course not. Of course we don't. The ceiling of the Queen's house. It's a ceiling, right? This was gifted from Queen Anne to Sarah Churchill. They wrote each other love letters. This is a queer, biromantic queen that we had. Is there a panel? No, there's no panel. And this is the classic sodomy record that we have many and many of. And that's another thing to point to. A lot of the time, the stuff that actually directly says it's on paper, you know, we have that same-sex or that trans experience, it's from the criminal record, so it's quite a negative account. But the idea is put a queer eye onto a space and they're there. We've always been here. LGBTQ plus people have always been here. If you haven't found us, it's because you're not looking hard enough. LGBTQ plus history is salacious, sordid, and adults only. Now, few people would say that directly to me because they know they would piss me off. But one of the things you'll find is more and more we are starting to do queer lates. We are starting to do things that focus on gender and sexuality. But it's naughty. It's always with a glass of red wine after hours in the dark, bit dirty, bit salacious, 18 plus only, all right? We don't need to do that. You can talk about homosexuality, transgender experiences without talking about genitalia. It is possible. So every year we run Out at Sea, which is an LGBTQ plus family festival. It is marketed to and for families. Everything we do is family appropriate. And there's multiple reasons for doing that. One of them is there are LGBTQ plus families. I'm about to become a father myself. We exist, and we need spaces to go where we can be safe. And also, when you are legitimizing LGBTQ plus history by saying that this is appropriate for children, you are saying this is appropriate for everyone. It's not dirty to be queer. So that's one of my big bugbears. 3, LGBTQ plus audiences are too small to be of importance. They're niche, and we get this. This can be applied across all protected characteristics. What if you're too small? Really, is there any point? It's nice, but can it have the small cabinet in the corner? Do we have to do a full event? Does it need a timeout spread? And I think the answer to that is, in some ways we are small. We're smaller than the majority, but we're an incredibly loyal and engaged audience. And we're hungry because there's not much stuff out there. If you create content for us and you do it sincerely, and maybe talk to us first as well, we do like that, we'll come. And we'll come in droves, and we'll buy a ticket, and also we'll keep coming, and we'll talk about it, and we'll tell our friends about it, because guess what? There's not much going on. So you will gain yourself this really interested, goal-directed audience that cares about your sites. This, again, can be applied to all protected characteristics. So this is the fierce Queen's takeover we did of the Queen's house. So going back to spaces, and how do you make spaces friendly for different audiences? The Queen's house is a fantastic place for weddings. It looks like a fancy tissue box, if you've ever been to one. It's very pretty, but basically it's nearly always closed for events, and it has basically never been anything other than a lovely white space for lovely white people. And that's pretty much what it's been. More recently, we've discovered that it's a beautiful space for performances, for activities, for young people, for doing Black History Month, for working with LGBTQ audiences. So we did a queer takeover. We took the stories of the ceiling, we took the Evelyn de Morgan painting, and we turned them into performance pieces by drag artists. And people bloody loved it. It was amazing. We sold out. It actually was one of the most most engaged events we've ever put on for any audience. So forget niche. If you do it right, you're going to get a lot of buzz. This is the economic argument for diversity. It is worth doing. LGBTQ+ history is not relevant to our core responsibilities and remits. This is, I'm not going to in any way shame the National Trust because they've done some incredible work, as has been pointed out. But there was last year the unfortunate Rainbow Gate, where it got picked up by certain parts of the press who started to say the National Trust is doing stuff for queer audiences. They're about tea and cakes and the standard traditional National Trust audience. We don't need to be doing this fancy right-on Guardian stuff. I would say, yes, you bloody do. Partly because your workforce looks like this. These are the people that work in museums and heritage institutions across the country. Every year for Pride, as part of Museum Pride London, we march in 200 to 300 to 400, growing every single year, workers from across the museum sector. We have a massive banner and we make a lot of noise, and there's a lot of us. So that's one of the reasons. But then it applies across the board. Your visitors, your stakeholders, the people that aren't and are coming to your museums, all define as LGBTQ+. They are part of that. And also the people paying the taxes that go into your institutions. So you are obliged morally and also because you're taking their money. So you kind of need to do that. So apologies for going on a bit of a soapbox thing there. I'm going to try and swing this around into a positive. What can we actually do and why should we actually do it? So look closely at your site and collections, museums, field of expertise with a queer eye. If you don't have a queer eye, that's fine. Find someone who does. We're all over the place. LGBTQ+ themes are relevant to all ages. And also, this goes for everything. You don't need to do LGBT History Month in February. It'd be nice if you did. But you can also do it in April. You don't need to just do Black History Month in October. You could also do it in February. Intersectionality, we all have these multiple identities that overlap. Work with your LGBTQ audience and be sincere and creative, and you will gain an incredibly loyal and engaged audience. It's not about being cynical, about the pink pound. You'll get people that care and love you, and if you love them back, that's a really great relationship to have with a heritage site. Remember, your staff, visitors, funders, and taxpayers are made of LGBTQ+ people. We're part of that. And also, our lives are part of the rich tapestry of human history. It's not that there is LGBT history and history. We are history. We're part of your story. We're not a footnote. So going back to the chair analogy, and I said that this presentation was going to be called having a chair at the table, having a seat at the table. Recently worked with the transgender youth group Mermaids UK. Over 3 years, we worked with these young trans teenagers, incredible young people. And we produced a permanent artistic response that is now in one of our new galleries. And they have taken mythology, researched our collections, and then taken in their own stories to create a piece that is completely their own, which is basically a genderless sea deity that actually speaks with the voice of one of the young people. And what they said, when we embarked on the project, we thought that they could pick someone from our archives, and they could, go, let's go for Anne Bonny. She was a cross-dressing pirate. She'll do. They said, there is no seat at this table for us, so we're not going to go down the stairs, find the seat that's available, blow the dust off, carry it upstairs, and then put it at the table. We're going to build our own from scratch. So it's about giving space sometimes, as I think Jonathan said earlier, that sometimes people want to engage in the way that they want to. And so you need to speak to them first. It's not about trying to make room. It's allowing them to decide how they want to interact with you. I could speak forever. I'm going to stop now. I'd love to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Sasha. That's brilliant. Thank you very much. Now, our final panelist this evening is Professor Margot Finn, as I say, President of the Royal Historical Society, Professor at UCL of Modern British History, has a specialism in 19th century British political cultural history, has written also about global history, the family, and material culture with her East India's at Home project. So over to you, Margot. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. I was a late addition to the schedule, and for a particular reason, which I'll come to in a moment. I do actually have a valid reason to be here as an historian. I did a project called the East India Company Home, working with the National Trust and other heritage organisations to try and tell the global histories of English, Scottish, and Welsh country houses. But that's not why I'm here today. Instead, I'm here today because on Thursday of last week, the Royal Historical Society, of which I am the president, published a report, Race, Ethnicity and Equality, a report and resource for change. It's free to download from our website, and I would strongly encourage you to do so. It is a resource that is predominantly focused on history in university departments, but it has resonance and relevance for schools and for heritage organizations. And we hope very much in the next 2 years to be developing that resonance as well. This is a report that we worked on for 1.5 years with a working group. It's about 120 pages long. It has many resources in it in the back, including heritage-related resources for schools, museums, and academic historians. It is in many ways, and I'm ashamed to say it, but it has to be said, an indictment of academic history in the UK for its lack of racial and ethnic diversity. We've taken a very strong look at ourselves and come up really challenged. We've done this report at this particular time because this is the 150th anniversary of the Royal Historical Society. We didn't just want that anniversary to be about celebrating 150 years. We wanted to take a critical look at ourselves and ask, how can we do history better in the next 150 years? And the bottom line really of this report is we can't do excellent history, something that as the Royal Historical Society we're meant to be doing, unless we do much more diverse history and unless we as a discipline are much more inclusive. And that really is the bottom line of our report. Now, I've highlighted there the winner of one of our 2018 Public History Prize projects, which was a project, Our Migration Story, run by the Runnymede Trust, funded by the Arts and Humanities Council. And I want to come back to that because I think public history is one of the areas of history where diversity and inclusion are most manifest and where we academic historians need to look most carefully for the future. So I'll come back to that in a moment, but first I want to just give you a couple of overviews of findings from our report. First of all, there is an obvious, robust, rich potential pipeline into history from schools. There's no question about that. History is a very popular subject at GCSE. It's a very popular subject at A-level. Many students do it. However, and here I think the curriculum has a lot to answer for, already in school, already at A-level, disproportionately white students take history A-level, disproportionately black and ethnic minority students don't. You can see this here in the most recent cycle, 15.4% of black and minority ethnic students took history A-level, whereas 22.2% of white students did so. White and BME are both problematic terms. We've used them because they are the terms in the statistics. This pipeline, which is already narrowing at A-level, gets worse in terms of BME diversity as one moves into university and as one progresses from undergraduate to master's to PhD level. And that has major implications for us as employers of academics in history departments. And I would emphasize very much what we've heard before. If you don't have diverse staff, you'll have difficulty getting diverse audiences. We face precisely that problem in academic history in university history departments. So at undergraduate level, history is located together statistically in historical and philosophical studies. That's a grouping that includes not only history, but also archaeology and heritage studies, which is always very relevant for you as well. And it begins as a subject that's about half as diverse as university cohorts overall at undergraduate level, and it gets worse at master's level. It gets worse again at PhD level. And as I say, that's really killing us in terms of diversity, in terms of hiring of academic staff. That's a problem we've now recognized. It's a problem we have to rectify. Here, and I won't speak in this talk about gender, but our gender report comes out on the 5th of November, and I've chosen this very masculinist version of a black-white history with that in mind. In the UK, about 85% of all academic staff are white, and in history, it's 93.7%. That's a really horrifying statistic, and that's something we have to do something about. In this research that underpins our research, 737 master's students, PhD students, and academic staff members in history responded to our survey. The survey did reveal high levels of bias and discrimination in our history departments, very much disproportionately orientated towards black and minority ethnic historians. That's something we've got to own up to. That's something we recognize we've got to change. And our resource, our report, does include a specific section targeted at different constituencies within academic departments, PhD supervisors, personal tutors of undergraduate students, heads of department, with tailored advice as to what each of us in those different capacities, when we inhabit them, needs to do. One of the major diversifying impulses within academic history is the ability to hire international staff. And obviously at this particular moment, this is very worrying. International hires in the academy are much more diverse racially and ethnically than our UK born and domiciled staff. Now, that's not a route that we can use. We can't simply ignore the fact that we're not succeeding with UK-born academic staff, obviously, but it does mean that if the ability to employ non-UK-born nationals is diminished, the diversity and inclusion of our academic departments will diminish with it, which is obviously very worrying. And you can see here, we've laid out the statistics. You can't simply say this is a problem with academia. This is a problem with history. We're one of the 5 least diverse disciplines in terms of race and ethnicity. It's simply not acceptable in the 21st century. What can be done? I've just outlined here a few bullet points for you. First of all, we have to accept that we have a problem, and that's what we hope our new report published last week does. It puts us squarely in the problem rather than ascribing the problem to somebody else or saying that it doesn't exist. And I think it's pretty difficult to read our report, not only the qualitative evidence, but also the quantitative evidence, and to not accept that we have a problem. I think we have to increase the flow of black and minority ethnic students into archaeology, into heritage studies, into history at undergraduate level. Schools and their interface with schools is going to be very important there. But museums and heritage sites are one of the most important ways that students can come to love history. And I don't need to tell you that because you've just listened to some wonderful panel presentations that demonstrate how we can and should do this. Diversify curriculums. I have to say I'm relatively proud of the fact that since Thursday we've twice been denounced in the Daily Telegraph and once in the Daily Mail for what we've said about the curriculum. But we've looked at it very, very seriously. We need to diversify the curriculum if we want to diversify the personnel. Offer targeted, explicit, not implicit guidance on careers. And I've taken very careful notes about what you were saying about museum staff. Likewise, in academia, we have to tell students explicitly how you get from point A to point B, and that you have to do point B if you want to do point C. We cannot make that tapping someone on the shoulder. We can't use the phrase, but everybody knows that, because everybody doesn't. So diversifying through that kind of career advice is really important. I think we have to identify areas. Public history is one of the big ones that are more diverse than we are, and we have to be tapping that knowledge. And that obviously extends not just to BME diversity, but to all other kinds of diversity. And then finally, we've got to enhance training within our institutions about the Equality Act 2010. In our various reports, between 30 and 50% of people don't know what the Equality Act is. They don't know what a protected person or a protected characteristic is. Well, that law is there for a reason, and it protects us all. One of the things we would argue in the Royal Historical Society it protects is excellence, because diversity and inclusion are integral to excellence. And that's all I want to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Margot. Now, there we are. We've got, I think, about 10, maybe 15 minutes. Time for discussion anyway, before we have some refreshment outside. So we've had some wonderful presentations. They've all been brilliant, and they've all been incredibly inspirational in terms of the thoughts that jump into one's head. Can I throw open the floor to comments and observations, questions perhaps for some of our panellists about anything that's come up this evening, and we'll see where the discussion takes us. Would anyone like to make a reflection on their own organisation or their own practice or a project that you might have been involved in? Can I see any? We've got some mics going around the room if people want to make points at this stage. Peter, thank you very much for volunteering. It's very kind.
I was really interested. I wanted to reflect on one of the best stories we've had in the press this year. So we're a charity. We look after 353 historic churches across England that don't have congregations anymore. And our best visited site is Holy Trinity in Goodramgate. And the reason it got such great press, the story that just kept on giving, and it was about putting a plaque up to Anne Lister, who, and it's a really interesting story. It's an absolutely fabulous story about Anne Lister is an amazing woman in the 18th century who, and potentially is the first ever recorded gay wedding. Takes place in Holy Trinity, Goodramgate. Fairly controversial. It's a fabulous story, but it got completely hijacked by the wording on the plaque. Now, we thought we'd done everything correctly. Well, it wasn't our plaque, I hasten to add, in the first place. We talked, and they'd done a lot of consultation with the community about the wording on the plaque. But in the end, the plaque, there was a huge outrage about the wording on the plaque, and we were finding it hard to fathom why that had done. And I was just interested that we tried to do something really good because it's a great story to get it out there, and it sort of got hijacked by this sort of argument within a community, if you see what I mean. And I'd just be interested in any advice as what we could have done better and how to avoid an argument in a community taking over the actual real story.
Yeah, good point, Sasha. Do you want to?
Yeah, was the issue around misgendering?
Yes.
Yeah.
Whether it was the word lesbian or not.
Okay. So one of the things that we come across a lot is those records where you have someone who cross-dresses or dresses as a gender that they weren't assigned at birth, possibly has relationships with other people. Also the situation where someone may be with a same-sex partner, but may at the same time or previously have been with an opposite-sex partner. So can you call that person gay? Is that person actually a woman? All of these kind of questions do come up, and it is complex. But one of the things is that when you make that mistake, because you will make mistakes, because there's a lot of things that are happening, it's about having a lot of humility around it. And as long as you are instantly able to open that conversation and say, you're right, what can we do to change it? Then
that was fine. We did all that.
Yeah.
And it was just that the shame was the story that overtook the story about Anne Lister.
I think that one of the issues I hear a lot, so again, speaking as a gay man, is often we sort of take over the LGBTQ plus community and history. So often someone who was possibly bi, we will instantly say they're gay, and the woman that they were married to or with before was just cuckolded. She was completely oblivious, or possibly that was something that he did just to keep up his secret gay love affair. And I think that comes from wanting to see ourselves in history. But there are complexities in that where there is trans exclusion and there is bi erasure, which does happen. So it's unfortunate, but we are an LGBTQ plus community. We're made up of lots of different parts. And it is incredibly complex, and mistakes are made. I hosted a talk at Royal Museums Greenwich in February. It was about trans and intersex identities in Indigenous cultures. And one presentation, I thought the content was incredible, but the individual who presented misgendered repeatedly and really upset a number of people in the audience. And so the debate then became around the misgendering. The issue was then the speaker didn't quite back down and sort of fell back on their academia, and then it just became plain offensive. But, there's nothing wrong with making a mistake. Normally, maybe not in this case, as long as it's reconciled properly and there's an honest apology and there is active work to rectify what went wrong. Normally the main message does get through.
It's a great story. Great story. We've got a few hands coming up. Margot, is there anything to add from a historical profession point of view? I mean, how far does the academy get involved in these sorts of discussions as well?
Well, I think part of the problem here is our inability, or the inability of many forms of media to recognize complexity. And I suppose as an historian and academic history, the complexity is why we love doing it. And then I think there's an assumption on the part of many media outlets, and Twitter does add to this in some way, that it can only be one or the other. And it's then we don't necessarily have the skills to translate that. And I don't want it to be only one thing or the other, because that very often excludes significant populations. So I think one of the things we do have to do is push back against these really binary discussions that so exclude, so divide. And so perhaps that's one of the things we need to do. If you do listen to some of the television history debates in the UK in the 1950s, it was a lot more complex. Well, people are a lot more educated now today than they were then. They have a lot more access to all kinds of information. Why can't we be allowed to make hard-hitting, powerful arguments that nonetheless recognize our complexity as human beings? I think that's a real shame. So I think pushing back against some of that is perhaps something we need to do.
Thank you. Brilliant. I saw some hands going up. Yes.
Hi. I had an experience recently, and I was very horrified, actually, Professor Finn, by your statistics on history. And now my experience is still ongoing with the BBC, and I think it's something that, if you could comment on, I'd love you to, Professor Finn. I challenged a TV program that was done recently, about 6 months ago, that presented false history in a documentary about the Commonwealth. And it's taken me months to go through the channels that the BBC offers if you have a complaint. I'm a researcher, so I did my thorough research. And it's been amazing, the kind of David and Goliath experience that I'm having with regards to just trying to live in a country that will present correct history on the national television, on a channel that we pay for as license fee payers. So they have finally conceded that they're wrong about the issue I raised, re-accuracy. And what's going to happen is that a tiny half of a sentence will appear in the complaints section of their website on a program that aired on Easter Monday at 9 p.m., prime time audience that reached millions. And I mean, I'm personally so outraged by this, it's unbelievable. But I'm also the daughter of a historian. I'm the child of a black historian, which by your statistics tells me I'm a rarity. And it really makes everything that was shared tonight come to life. You know, the Colonial Countryside Project will hopefully address that statistic regarding future young historians of colour in this country. But it's taken one individual in this country to challenge the BBC and succeed, and nobody in the country will ever hear about it.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I don't think there's much you can say, really. But
yeah, I mean, the statistics are horrifying. You know, one wonderful development this week, though it's wonderful in the context of a horrible statistic, is this week has seen the first black female UK history professor elevated to having a chair. And that, as I say, it's a punch you in the stomach, horrible statistic. Why are there not, many black women history professors in the UK. There are certainly many white women history professors in the UK. But on the other hand, there it is, that's happened. And that's been retweeted over 1,000 times. We historians don't normally get retweeted over 1,000 times on anything because it sets, all of a sudden it says, okay, this is possible, this is going to happen. But it's, as I say, it's a horrifying statistic at the same time. So I think just to go back to your point, I can't really speak to the BBC's complaints process, so that sounds horrific. But one of the things we have to do, I think, if we're going to get diversity and inclusion right, we've got to stop being so defensive. And I absolutely take your point about just apologize, for God's sake. You know, because if you're going to put your head above the parapet, and if you're coming from a white privileged position, as, for example, I do, you're going to get it wrong. But the worst thing you can do is not to do it at all. So I think we have to become less defensive at that level. I don't want to make mistakes. I do not want to make, bad mistakes with regard to any protected characteristic. But the worst thing for me is to say, okay, so I'm not going to go near those protected characteristics, because that's the worst form of exclusivity that we can do.
Excellent, good. Other points? Thank you.
I would like to make a question as a researcher. I'm a PhD candidate at Goldsmiths. I'm at the final stage of my thesis. My thesis is how we make heritage inclusive to young people. I'm at a stage of analysis, and two key things I would like to share with you tonight, reflecting on this interesting debate. Young people have very diverse understanding of identities, and protected characteristics are not working for the young people. If we have to think of the younger generations, we have to think beyond the Equality Act. Young people don't identify themselves. They are more mixed. We have more mixed heritage populations in the school population at the moment than ever in the UK history. And I try to think people who have mixed heritage, because I'm coming from a mixed heritage background. The other thing that I would like to share is quite important if we have to think to the next generations, is how we exclude and how we speak about these things. From my experience as working in the disability sector, for me and what I understood is inclusion is how we talk and open the conversation. And my experience is that in the heritage sector, we spend a lot of time with closed walls. We don't understand what's happening in the local communities or outside in the society. We spend so much time talking about diversity and inclusion when actually the social reality is exclusion, barriers, very conservative politics, and very, 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 very bleak austerity policies. Just I would like to make that the two things. And my question to the debate is, would we should do better to think of the protected characteristics not as a starting point, but as stops in the journey we have with different groups?
Excellent, thank you. Do you want to, yes?
Yeah, so not sort of directly about the characteristics that you've talked about, but in our project we looked at a lot of that, and obviously we had, for our funding and through kind of the inception of the project, we obviously had a very targeted group of people for our resources. And I think it's really key that, a project straight away, it has to go beyond that, and that's through being open and inclusive and equally being able to hold your hands up and correct things. And certainly for our project, a huge kind of core thing has been having our advisory panel, which is made up of all of the various participants in our project. So a huge kind of label and sort of, I guess, characteristic that is a big one for us is this characteristic of refugee or forced migrant. And it's a term that we use a lot because it's an identifier. It's, it's kind of what we have to speak to, when we're reporting to our funder. When I'm here talking to people like this about our project and who it's benefiting and what it's doing, it's a term we have to use. But actually, very early on in our discussions with people who were getting involved, they didn't want to be identified in that way. They had many, these are people who have, have all kinds of different backgrounds. They're photographers, they, were writers, they were, studying, they were students, all of these different things. And actually they didn't simply want to be able to sort of serve any kind of larger agenda and just to be identified as refugees. And we have done a huge amount of shaping of our project where and we came up with a project values document which was signed up, and the whole thing is that everyone is treated as an individual and that they self-determine their course within the project. And we've even had to push back against sort of higher ups who have thought, oh well great, they can really provide messages that speak to migration and they can talk about those journeys of migration. And we said, well actually our participants don't necessarily want to talk about that. That's not necessarily what they are here to participate in. And and actually empowering the individuals that are working on our project to say no. One of the first things we do in their induction is that we talk to them about setting their own boundaries and not allowing other people to come in and identify them, because they will encounter any number of people in their capacity, members of the public, other people that work in the museum, and we do our best to make sure that everyone that comes into contact with our participants is aware of our values. But we've had instances where people immediately go straight into probing questions, which could be triggering, and so we do a huge amount of work in empowering people to kind of self-identify, to draw those boundaries, and to not allow themselves to be kind of simply defined by their characteristic. Yeah.
Thank you, Abby. I think we've got. Sorry.
I wanted to respond to that because I think it's a very interesting question, actually, about classification in a way, and that museums are spaces for classification. It's a really awkward collision, actually, and I agree with you that we shouldn't be limited by these categories, protected characteristics. We should actually be deconstructing them. And I think that, going back to my earlier comments about working with contemporary art, I think that the contemporary art world has interrogated identity in a different way to museums. So you get, for example, terms like diaspora, which are much more prevalent in the art world in terms of curating and working with artists who have actually interrogated identity and opened it up. And I think this is the gap that I was referring to between arts and heritage. So there's other words that, there's a great cultural writer, Homi Bhabha. He talks about hybridization as a sort of cultural process, and that we don't have singular identities, and that it's a much more complex thing than these systems of classification. So I actually think that one way of opening this up actually is not only working with communities in some of the ways that have been described, but actually artists. And my PhD was about artistic responses to museums, and it is amazing the work that post-colonial artists have done in interrogating these questions. And I think there's a big gap, particularly in our museums, in engaging with this work.
Oh, Cohen, yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think there's another gap as well, which is a generation gap. And that Birmingham, for example, where you can hear I come from, they've just opened up the first ever centre for super diversity and the study of the idea of super diversity, i.e. that there are children who have heritage stretching to 3 or more continents. And my own son, who's 10, is growing up in a situation where every child is different from every other child. There are no two people who look alike or who have the same heritage. It's unbelievably diverse. And I think that those of us sitting in that room, most of us have not experienced that. And these children are. And that all these categories and classifications that we have will be laughable to them when they're the age that we are. So
I'm going to take a few more points. There's a point at the back, and then I'll come to Becky here.
Judith Martin, Heritage Trust Network. We had our conference last year on the theme of, I think we called it access rather than diversity. But basically, it was about expanding audiences. And Ben, when you introduced people, you mentioned class, and I think Errol mentioned class. And there is this thing about people thinking this is not for the likes of us, and sometimes even being told that it's not for the likes of us. And the particular thing I have in mind was a big row a few years ago at Southampton City Gallery, which is very important in a Grade 2 listed building, Grade 2 star, and a fantastic collection. And to expand the gallery, the council wanted to sell some works of art. And the art world and the museum world rose up in horror. But the local press thought this was a really good idea because there's all this elite stuff that isn't for their readership at all how exclusive it all is, and wouldn't it be best just to flog it and preferably build an ice rink? So what on earth do you do about that? We have got to get to... the star turn at our conference last year was actually a woman from Granby 4 Streets, which had been part of the Turner Prize-winning outfit with Assemble Architects the year before, I think. And she did a piece on the people who know how people like us should live. And I just don't see... yes, there's sort of intersectionality, and if you're black, minority, ethnic, you're more likely to be less well off, shall we say. But I don't know how we're reaching out to them, except kind of incidentally. And there are huge swathes of people that we're really not reaching at all yet.
Thank you, Judith, for raising that. I think what I might do is take a few other questions that have come up, or points that have come up, and then we'll have a collective sort of response. So can we ask you?
Yeah, I'll be very quick. Hello. One of the things that I'm particularly keen on, particularly with DCN, is the idea that when you visit a museum, the information that you seek should not necessarily be about the condition that you have. So in respect to this is for people with X, this is for people with Y, and things like that. Because I remember a few years ago somebody coming up to me and saying, we give out coloured overlays to dyslexic people. If you see somebody and nobody uses a coloured overlay in a public space if you've got dyslexia. I've worked with adults for 5 years. I know about dyslexia in respect to my experiences with those groups. And the key thing is that it's like wearing a pair of dealy boppers on your head. Hello, I've got a problem with my reading. I've got a problem with information processing. This is more about inclusion and seeing how Captions is always a key example. We work with other sectors in relation to what they're doing. Captions help everybody, from people who have got a cough and they've not picked up a word, people who are hard of hearing, people who are deaf, people who are neurodivergent and have difficulty with sensory sensitivity. This is what we should be steering towards, absolutely on identity, absolutely if you should need that kind of information of what to look for, but this is more about inclusion of how you can actually have a potential solution for a number of audiences. So I just wanted to throw that.
Thank you very much. That's brilliant. Are there any... Yes, Alice. Yeah. Can we pass the microphone to the front here? Thank you.
Hi, Alice Perkis from Oxford University and the National Trust. 2 hats at once. Really quick question. Do you think, as a panel, cultural programming around significant historical anniversaries is helping or hindering telling diverse stories?
Very good question. I mean, on that question and indeed on the previous 2 points, does anyone on the panel want to make an observation? Corinne, do you want to have a go?
Yeah, I think that is such an important question because it's so often tagged to funding and, how can we make it relevant? As if all the other stuff isn't relevant because it's not an anniversary. But one of the things I was talking about earlier is that in the case of my project, even though I'm not actually an historian, I work with artists, writers and historians. It's so obvious that if you let the history of a house lead and you're looking into connections to empire, then you're going to get a really unfamiliar and interesting stories coming out that wouldn't come out if you were trying to fit something into a mould which has already been given to you.
I think there's no yes or no to... I think there's a kind of crass response to anniversaries that you can have, and there's a more intelligent one. So you can... just to mention a couple. In 2007, it was the bicentenary of the abolition... Sorry, it's the parliamentary abolition of the slave trade. I have to get that right. And during that year, and it is very important to commemorate that year. So I should say that first of all, absolutely important that we should remember that. But I was working at the Arts Council at the time, and there are many artists who got commissioned that year, and I don't think they've worked since, actually. So it wasn't, it's important to remember that. But if you only think of commissioning black artists during that particular year, or in October or November during Black History Month, that's a debased response. But a more recent one, the partition of India, absolutely important that we should remember this traumatic past. But if we're only going to remember it at that point, that's a debased response. So I think it has to be nuanced.
I think it's about legacy. Yeah. And that's what you want. You want a legacy so that something changes as a result of the activity that you've done. And it doesn't just change for that year, it changes forever. Yeah. And that's the kind of transformation that you want to do. I mean, I'm sure you're probably right that you can have intelligent responses to anniversaries, but it's also true that you have to make sure that that's absolutely embedded. And that's the challenge, really.
If I could respond, firstly rewind to the talk of the person who mentioned class, I would really recommend looking up Museum as Muck. If you're on Twitter at all, it's a new group which is for working class museum professionals and trying to further that cause. They are doing an intervention at the Museum Association conference in Belfast. So that's something to look into. There's some heat around that, and it's really interesting stuff, particularly the story that you told. It's that kind of work that they're looking into. What is culture worth anyway if we're just being told that it's, this is worthy because some people say it is? Then going to the thing of anniversaries, this is something that is a real bugbear of mine, but also I can see that it plays a role. So kind of like a clothesline approach. Let me explain. So if you have, for queer histories, you have February, and then you have July. So you have Pride, and you have LGBT History Month. And they're these big pinnacles. Suddenly, I'm really popular then, and then decline in between, which I think a lot of people on this panel can probably associate with. But at least they're clotheslines, and then you hang the rest of your programming in between. So you have these peaks, and you know they're going to happen. And if you work at some institutions, particularly those that are lower funded, that are very early on in this diversity journey, where there's nothing, you need to start somewhere. And LGBT History Month for the queer community is where the heat is. So you start there. And then you go, also, there's this thing called Pride. And also, March is Women's History Month. Did you know that some queer people are women? Oh, actually, October, some queer people are black too. And then it starts to grow, and then you find it's more naturally feeding through. That's the kind of model I'm going for. And then one last thing, and I will shut up, I promise. One of the things that I want to kind of get off my chest is that we are talking a lot about hard-to-reach audiences, which is a really horrible phrase to use, and the idea that it's really hard to do diversity, it's hard work, as if diversity is this weird outside thing that we're all struggling to achieve. It's alien, and museums are just not set up to do it. Heritage is not set up to do it. Diversity exists in the real world. That's the natural way that things are. We're talking about the way that school children grow up and the kind of experiences they have. That's what the real world looks like. We're not reflecting that. So it's not that this is a struggle that we will have to kind of go, oh, God, how are we going to do it? It's simply like, how do we break down the walls? Because diversity is doing fine in some ways. It exists fine outside of museums. It's just not in us yet.
Quite right, very good. Now, I think we've got time for a couple more observations if anyone has them. Otherwise, the wine glasses are next door and they're being prepared for us. Does anyone want to... yes, at the back. Thank you.
I'm not going to comment much on all the speeches I've listened to this evening, which are really, really interesting. I'm actually representing an organisation called the British Association of Friends of Museums, which some of you may have heard of, some of you may not. We're a really important organisation because friends of museums often make it possible for museums to stay open 5 days a week, 6 days a week by giving their time on front desks, etc., etc. One of the reasons I'm here tonight is because of one of the people up there on the platform, Abigail. We had our annual general meeting last week at which Lizzie came along and addressed us and gave us a wonderful talk. And in the process, she met Abigail. And hence, Abigail is there today and very important around the question of diversity and bringing young people from all groups into museums. My dream is that one day people will just go to museums like they go to the cinema or the bingo hall and everything else. And hopefully things are changing in schools to make that possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful dream, yeah. Excellent. On that uplifting note, perhaps it's time to draw things somehow to a close. It's once again, it's been a fantastic evening, a rich range of comments, speeches, observations, reflections from the floor. Thank you all for coming along. I suppose if I was trying to sum up what has been a very diverse evening and discussion in its own right, I suppose the first thing would be the absolute urgency of this issue. Completely we need to be on this as a sector, and I think that all the speeches tonight have underlined that utterly. The second point would be the call to action that we've heard, the practical things that we can all do when we go back to our jobs, if we're working in heritage or museums or the arts, the things we can do to bring diversity into the workplace, to bring diversity onto our boards, to open up our spaces to young people and to creative and interesting new uses so that we make them, as the lady at the back said, usable by everybody. And I think finally, just the inspiration. These events that the Alliance put on, I always find incredibly inspiring. This has really been about a lesson in being human, but it's been told in a completely inspiring, insightful way, and it certainly inspired me to think about what I do. So I want to, can we please express our thanks again to our panellists this evening. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to Ecclesiastical for supporting the evening. We're the Heritage Alliance, and now the instruction is make your way into the Palm Court for this evening's reception. And I hope you can stay and have a drink and some food with us. There's some food as well, if you're feeling peckish. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Corinne.